I was just pulling into my driveway after work when I saw the police cruiser parked by the community pond. My stomach dropped in our quiet Oakwood Heights neighborhood. Police visits usually mean-tone thing. Our HOA president Karen Peaton had found another victim for her power trips. As I jogged toward the pond, I could already hear her shrill voice cutting through the peaceful afternoon air. There, sitting on his favorite bench with his fishing rod cast into the water, was Walter Garrison, the 78-year-old grandfather. Had lived here longer than anyone else in the neighborhood, his weathered hands steady on the fishing pole despite the chaos erupting around him. Karen stood behind the officer, her arms crossed triumphantly across her chest. She wore her usual uniform of a crisp blazer and pressed slacks, her whole president badge pinned prominently to her lapel like a sheriff's star. Her blonde bob bounced with indignation as she gestured wildly at Walter. The officer looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight as he spoke to Walter, but what happened next would cost our HOA control over $2 million worth of waterfront property. Let Mac up and explain how we got here. Walter Garrison moved to Oakwood Heights in 1992, back when this area was mostly farmland and the pond was just a quiet fishing spot locals had used for generations. His modest ranch house sat in 3 acres with the pond marking the eastern boundary of his property. Every morning for over 30 years, Walter would walk down to that pond with his tackle box and spend a few peaceful hours fishing. Karen Peaton arrived 2 years ago, purchasing the McMansion at the top of Hillrist Drive. Within 6 months, she'd maneuvered her way onto the HOA board. Within a year, she was president, and from day one of her reign, she made it her mission to transform Oakwood Heights into what she called a premier residential community. First came the mailbox regulations, then the approved paint color list that somehow only included shades of beige and gray. Landscaping requirements follow at amending. Everyone maintained their yards, though country club standards, but her late crusade targeted the pond, which he declared an HOA exclusive amenity requiring special access permits. The morning of the incident started like any other. Walter had walked down to the pond around 7 o'clock, and coffee in one hand and tackle box in the other. He'd been there about an hour when Karen appeared marching down the gravel path in her power's suit. Despite it being Saturday, she announced in her most authoritative voice that effective immediately pond access required approval and a $50 monthly permit fee. Walter had simply smiled and continued fishing. That's when Karen lost it. I'd heard about the confrontation from my neighbor Janet, who had been walking her dog nearby, according to her. Karen had stood directly behind Walter, reading from the HOA bylaws in an increasingly hostile tone. When Walter didn't respond, she'd threatened to have him trespassed. When still didn't move, she'd pulled out her phone and dialed 911. By the time I reached the pond, half the neighborhood had gathered. Everyone knew Walter, and more importantly, everyone was sick of Karen's tyranny. We formed a semicircle around the scene, phones out, recording of everything. The officer, a young guy who looked fresh out of the academy, wastering to mediate, he spoke calmly to Walter, asking if he lived in any neighborhood. Walter nodded and pointed to his house visible through the trees. Officer then turned to Karen, asking her to explain the situation. Karen launched into a rehearsed speech about HOA regulations and property rights. She waved a manila folder containing what she claimed were the official documents proving the HOA owned the pond and surrounding land. Her voice grew more confident with each word, especially when she mentioned the estimated $2 million value of the waterfront property. The officer examined the papers, his brow furrowing. Then he asked Walter if he had any documentation of his own. Walter reached into his tackle box and pulled out a weathered envelope. Inside was a deed from 1992. That's when things got interesting. The officer studied the deed, then made a phone call. We all waited in tense silence as he spoke to someone at the county records office. Karen tapped her foot impatiently, shooting smug glances at the crowd as if to say, "This is what happens when you challenge my authority." 3 minutes, that's all it took for the county clerk to pull the records and deliver news that would change everything. The officer ended his call and cleared his throat. His next words made Karen's face go from triumphant to confused to absolutely horrified. According to the county records, the pond and a 50-foot easement around it had never been legally transferred to the HOA. A clerical error during the community's incorporation had left it under a public trust with specific rights tied to Walter's original deed. Not only was Walter allowed to fish there, but he might be the only resident with formally documented access rights. HOA had been enforcing rules on land it. Didn't actually control. Karen sputtered, her face turning various shades of red as she demanded to speak to the officer's supervisor, but the damage was done. Word spread through that crowd. Like wildfire, people started pulling up the website on their phones, looking at all the pond-related fees and fines that have been collected over the years. Someone shouted a question about whether they could get hair permit fees refunded. Another asked about the HOA's authority to issue fines for pond violations. The questions came faster and faster, and Karen had Nonsworth within an hour. Two officials from the county arrived to review the situation. They confirmed what the officer had discovered. The HOA's claimed ownership of the pond was based on invalid documentation. Worse, the error potentially affected the community's property values and future development rights. The lead county official, a nonsense woman named Patricia Holloway, sued a cease and desist order on the spot. The HOA was to immediately stop all enforcement actions related to the pond and refund any fees collected. She also mentioned that the county would be conducting a full audit of the HOA's property claims. Karen's humiliation was complete when Patricia required her to make a public statement. Standing there by the pond with Walter still calmly fishing in the background, Karen had to apologize for the misunderstanding and announced that all pond access restrictions were lifted immediately. The crowd's reaction was a mix of shock and satisfaction. Some people actually applauded, others immediately asked Walter if they could join him fishing within minutes. The oppressive atmosphere Karen had cultivated began to dissolve. Learned later that evening what happened in the emergency HOA board meeting. 3 board members resigned on the spot, distancing themselves from what they called Karen's reckless leadership. Their remaining members voted to hire an attorney to assess the HOA's liability. Legal assessment was devastating. Notably did the HOA owe thousands in refunds, but the loss of control over Thepend reduced the community's asset value by over $2 million. The HOA's insurance company launched an investigation into whether Karen's actions constituted negligence, but the story doesn't end with just the pond revelation. See, Walter had tried to warn Karen months earlier. It approached her after one of her first board meetings, holding the same envelope he'd shown the officer. He'd explained the easement situation calmly, even offered to show her the county records, but Karen had dismissed him with a wave of her manicured hand, telling him that old-timers like him needed to accept that things changed. The truth was Walter's family had owned the original farm that Oakwood Heights was built on when developers bought the land in the 1980s. Walter's father had negotiated perfect terms. The pond would remain accessible to the public with his family retaining permanent fishing rights. It was all there in black and white, filed with the county, never properly transferred. When the HOA formed, Karen's downfall accelerated when the local news picked up the story. The headline read, HOA president calls cops on elderly veteran, loses $2 million asset. Yes, Walter was also a Vietnam veteran. At a tale Karen would have known if she'd ever bothered to have a conversation with him instead of just issuing orders. Insurance company's investigation were of more troubling details. Karen had been sending cease and desist letters to residents about pond usage, threatening legal action she had no authority to pursue. She'd collected over $15,000 in pond permit fees that now had to be refunded with interest. Worse, she'd convinced the board to take out a loan for pond improvements using the property as collateral for something the HOA didn't even own. The state attorney general's office got involved when several residents filed formal complaints. They discovered Karen had been listing the pond as an HOA asset on loan applications and community marketing materials. Potential commit fraud. Her real estate license, which she'd used to boost her credibility as HOA president, came under review. The final blow came during the special community meeting the following week. Residents packed the clubhouse, demanding accountability. The atmosphere was electric, with years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. When the board treasurer revealed the full financial impact, not just the $2 million in lost assets, but another $800,000 in potential legal liabilities, gasps echoed through the room. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming she'd acted in good faith based on previous board documentation, but when residents started listing her various power trips and arbitrary fines her support of aprotetsamian. Mentioned the widow she'd fined $500 for having the wrong shade of Bayesian. Her mailbox another brought up the disabled veteran she'd threatened to swover his wheelchair ramp when the vote was called. Karen was removed from the board by a margin of 212-3. As their results were announced, she stood frozen at the podium, her mouth opening and closing, like a fish out of water. Then came the second vote, whether to pursue